Hey everybody, all right, we're back. So doing the endocrine system today, or on this unit 18 in your book. And what is the endocrine system? Well, it consists of several glands in the body. The ones we're going to be talking about are got the pituitary, the thyroid, the parathyroid, which are little dots on the back of the thyroid, and the adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidneys, the pancreas, which are right behind the stomach there, and I'm not sure why they've got it in that position. It's a little low. Anyway, I would think the pancreas would be up here a little farther. So anyway, the ovaries and testes. That's the first time I actually noticed that on this slide. Anyway, so we're going to talk about the endocrine system. So the endocrine system versus exocrine system, and I'll go to the next slide. Well, first I'll talk about the nervous versus endocrine system. The nervous system is your fast-acting system. It's short-lived unless you continue or repeat that initial stimulus. There's electrical signals. Those are the action potentials that shoot down the axons. So it's a fast-acting system. You get stimulus, you respond, and then it's over. It doesn't continue unless your brother keeps poking you in the side, and then eventually you haul off and say stop. But so that would be a continued stimulus. You keep getting that stimulus, but each stimulus, you get a stimulus and you have a reaction, then it stops, and you have another one that stops. Endocrine system is slow acting. It's longer lived. It continues way after the initial stimulus is gone until homeostasis comes back. So you have an imbalance of something, and you're going to release what are called hormones from the endocrine system that go and act on tissues that are distant from where the hormone is released. And these are all chemical signals. So there may be proteins or small molecules that are these hormones. Okay, next slide. So the difference between endocrine and exocrine system, we talk about the exocrine glands. We'll talk about those next time on the integumentary system. Those are exocrine glands. Are glands that secrete things through a duct. Okay, so a duct is a small tube. There's a little gland, a lot of cells here, and there's a duct. They secrete things and they flow down this duct into something else. That's the exocrine gland. And examples of those you have are sweat glands, sebaceous glands, which are oil glands, ceruminous glands, which are earwax glands, and then let's see. Also, you have part of the pancreas. Most of the pancreas actually is an exocrine gland. They secrete digestive enzymes into the small intestine. The cells that do that in the pancreas are called acinar cells. The endocrine glands, those from the Greek krinein, meaning to separate, endo meaning into. So it's a ductless gland. They're made from epithelial cells, and they secrete products into the fluid that's around the cells between tissues. And those products then diffuse across the interstitial fluid. That's the interstitial fluid there. They diffuse across that, across the blood vessel wall, then and into the bloodstream. And those molecules then go down and go to some tissue that's far distant from where the original hormone has been secreted. And it kind of seems haphazard because you got the cell produce something that just sets off and just hopes that it's going to go somewhere, but actually the whole system works and it goes in the bloodstream and actually goes to where it's supposed to go. And it travels to this distant, non-local organ to exert its effects. That's the classic endocrine system. There's also the non-classic endocrine system. The effects are on the same cell or a nearby cell. So you have if it works on the same cell, it's called an autocrine. It works on a nearby cell. It's a paracrine system, and we'll see that on the next slide. Okay, so here's the endocrine system, A up here. So you have a cell, and it secretes these little products, these little triangles here. And these little hormones, and they go into the bloodstream, and they go down here to a distant cell, somewhere far distant. A paracrine system, a tissue cell, secretes these little chemicals, and they diffuse over to a cell that's nearby. Maybe it's right the next one, or maybe it's a few cells down, but that's called a paracrine system. Then you have autocrine, where the cell secretes stuff, and it secretes and it flows right back on and has effects on that exact cell that secreted the stuff. But we're going to talk about the endocrine system, this part up here, the endocrine system today. Next slide. Oh, where there's the endocrine system, we're going to talk about that, where it secretes a hormone and it has an effect on a distant cell, and that is that effector, that hormone, is carried by the bloodstream down to the target cell. Next slide. So the two major types of hormones are amino acid based or cholesterol based. Amino acid based hormones, they're single amino acids. You can have small peptides, a few amino acids linked together with peptide bonds, or you can have protein hormones. So those are many amino acids linked with peptide bonds. These are water soluble usually, except for thyroid hormone, which is based on tyrosine, which is a hydrophobic amino acid, so it doesn't like water, so it tends to be more fat soluble. And then and places that make these are the anterior pituitary, pancreas, thymus, thyroid, parathyroid glands. We're talking about what all those glands are. I just pointed them out on a couple slides ago. But and then here you go. Here's what you call an amino acid with attitude. It's an amino acid. So, or what do you call an acid with attitude? It's an amino acid. I said it wrong. It's late. Sorry. Anyway, next slide. So continuing on, so cholesterol-based hormones, what are they? Well, cholesterol is a ring compound. So this is cholesterol here, cholesterol, and you make it. So your liver makes that, and then you secrete it out, and it actually gets converted into other forms. So you get estradiol down here, progesterone. You have testosterone, and then back behind me is estrogen. So there's different forms of those of cholesterol that can be made. Cholesterol since it has these rings, and doesn't have rings don't have a polarity to them. They don't have a charge on one side. Don't have different charges on one side or the other. Like water has charges. You have water and an H, an O, and H. So HOH is water. And this tends to be a little bit negative, and this tends to be a little bit positive. So it's a polar molecule, means it has minus and plus signs. Cholesterol does not have that polarity. It's non-polar. So non-polar means it's lipid soluble. So that kind of stuff can pass right through a cell plasma membrane very easily. Water can't. It has to have a pore in the cell membrane to let water go through. So you have those aquaporins that let water go in back and forth across the membrane. So, and this is polar. It's a polar molecule. So anyway, cholesterol and the derivatives of cholesterol are fat lipid soluble. And the places that you make these hormones are adrenal cortex, ovaries, and testes. Okay, next slide. So the major endocrine and neuroendocrine organs. So we're going to talk about neuroendocrine, meaning it is derived from neural tissue. And so we're going to talk about there's 7 primary endocrine organs and 4 secondary endocrine organs. Primary ones are you got thyroid, parathyroid, thymus, the anterior pituitary, adrenal cortex, pancreas, ovaries, and testes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So basically we're including the ovaries and testes as one, since they're reproductive. Then we've got 4 on here. We've got the hypothalamus, pineal gland, posterior pituitary, and the adrenal medulla. So we're not going to talk much about the secondary endocrine organs. We'll talk a little bit about them, but mostly we're going to focus on the primary ones in this session today. Next slide. Well, let's see. I want to point out one other thing. Sometimes the ovaries and testes are considered to be secondary endocrine organs because they're part of the reproductive system. And also, just to point out, the pancreas has an endocrine portion and an exocrine portion. Just keep that in mind. We'll come back to that later. Okay, next slide. Okay, major endocrine organs. This is a picture out of the Practice Anatomy Lab online for your textbook. So we're showing the thyroid gland here. I can't draw on that unless I go to white. I go white. There we go. So thyroid gland. The adrenal glands, you have a right one and a left one, so you can see you have a kidney. So here's your adrenal gland there, and here's the left one here. Here'd be your kidney, and here's your other kidney over here. So that's a kidney. And then down here we have a testes. I have one on this side that's visible on that side. So they've cut away, obviously they cut away, they cut away the lungs and the heart. So there's not much there. Up here you see the thyroid gland. It's this little shape right up here. Okay, then we're going to see all those, but this just gives you a location of the whole body of where thyroid, adrenal, and the testes are located. Next slide. Okay, first one we're going to talk about is the pituitary gland, and it is on the base of the brain. So here's the pituitary right here. And this is pointing out a couple of other things. The optic nerves here, which you remember those. There's the optic nerve, and the other part would be coming off here. So coming out of the optic chiasma. Then there's something called the tuber cinereum, which is this section here. It's right near the infundibulum, which where the pituitary hangs. So remember, you have the pituitary hanging down here, infundibulum, and right above that is the tuber cinereum. And so that's all right down below the hypothalamus. And so we're going to take a look at that here in a second. Actually, I guess I could draw that for you. So here's you got the hypothalamus hanging down, infundibulum here, and the pituitary hanging off here. So there's the infundibulum, pituitary. And this is the hypothalamus. There. Okay, all right. So, and then the tuber cinereum is this section right here, this kind of area here. All right, next slide. So we have the pituitary, and the hypothalamus is up above it, and that controls the pituitary. So we have the hypothalamus releases hormones, and a lot of these are we call it releasing hormones. They bind to the anterior part of the pituitary gland. There's two parts of the pituitary gland. There is a front part and a back part, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. The hypothalamus hormones act on the anterior pituitary, and there's gonadotropin. Oops, I need to go back to black. My black color. So we have gonadotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, prolactin releasing hormone, prolactin inhibiting hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, and somatostatin. Those all work on the anterior pituitary. Okay, so that whole set there does that. So what does gonadotropin releasing hormone do? Well, it stimulates two hormones. Follicle stimulating hormone, or stimulates the release of FSH and luteinizing hormone, LH. Corticotropin releasing hormone stimulates the release of ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. And then thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, stimulates the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. Prolactin releasing hormone stimulates the release of prolactin. Prolactin inhibiting hormone, or dopamine, inhibits the release of prolactin. And growth hormone releasing hormone stimulates the release of growth hormone. And somatostatin inhibits the release of growth hormone. So these guys are antagonistic, and these guys are antagonistic. It's not really good arrows there. Okay. So, and let's see. Then we have a couple others. They're released by the hypothalamus. The antidiuretic hormone, ADH, acts on the kidney. and stimulates water retention or decreased urine output. And then also oxytocin, which acts on the uterus and mammary glands. It stimulates uterine smooth muscle contraction and myoepithelial cells, secretion by myoepithelial cells in mammary glands. All right, so we have the hormones released by the hypothalamus in the brain, and those act on the pituitary. We're going to see the little diagram here next. Okay, next slide. So here's your hypothalamus up here. And so you can see that little V-shaped portion down here, and you got the infundibulum where the pituitary gland is hanging off of. And you notice that it's hanging down, the pituitary is hanging down here in the sella turcica. So there's the sella turcica, and I'm losing my voice for some reason. So here's your pituitary gland, and it's hanging right off the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is helping control the pituitary, so it sends hormones down to act on the anterior pituitary to cause it to release hormones. So we have hormones coming off of the hypothalamus. So we're going down to the lower part here, hypothalamus, and it releases hormones that come down here and they act on the anterior pituitary. So, and this is the optic chiasma here, so that reminds you that that's the anterior side. Anterior pituitary is also called the adenohypophysis. Hypophysis is another name for the pituitary gland. So hypophysis there. So you can have the adenohypophysis, and the backside, the posterior pituitary is called the neurohypophysis. So you can see neuro there. So the reason it's called adenohypophysis is it's the origin of this anterior pituitary is from the epithelial cells. It actually came from the roof of the mouth. There was a pinch out that came up, and it actually went back up into the head. And the posterior hypophysis, pituitary, you can see this whole stuff here. It's hanging down off of neural tissue, the hypothalamus. So it's actually composed. It actually came from the diencephalon originally, and that was its origin cells. So you actually have these two sections here. You have one that's epithelial in origin and one that's neural cell in origin. And so anyway, so that's the so hypothalamic hormones zip around here, and they act on the anterior pituitary. And also, posterior pituitary also releases some hormones. We'll talk about those in a second. Okay, next slide. Okay, and I redid the slide, earlier slide that I went through that's in your book because they left out a couple things. So I thought I'd do this. So go back to, well, I went through the hypothalamic hormones before. I'm going to do the anterior pituitary hormones now. They left a couple things out of the pituitary hormones, and we're going to go over those. So we have the hypothalamic hormones acts on the anterior pituitary to cause it to release follicle stimulating hormone. So that's one of the things that's released by the anterior pituitary. You also have luteinizing hormone that's released because when the hypothalamus tells it to. Thyroid stimulating hormone is released when the hypothalamus tells it to. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is released when the hypothalamus tells it to, and growth hormone is released when the hypothalamus tells it to, and the prolactin is released when the hypothalamus tells it to as well. There's also other, this is all from the anterior pituitary. There's the posterior pituitary, and what does it release? Well, it releases two things, oxytocin, which acts on the uterus and mammary glands, stimulates the smooth muscle contraction, and antidiuretic hormone, ADH, or also called vasopressin, and acts on the kidney, stimulates water retention or decreases urine output. There's also a little part that's not talked about in your book. It's called the intermediate pituitary, also called and these are also have various sundry other names. So the anterior pituitary is also called the adenohypophysis, so it's also called the pars anterior. The intermediate pituitary is also called the pars intermedia, or the intermediate lobe of the anterior pituitary. Usually when you talk about the intermediate pituitary, a lot of times people just lump it together with the anterior pituitary, but there is a difference. It actually is a slightly separate, it's a separate region. Intermediate pituitary releases what's called melanocyte stimulating hormone, which acts on melanocytes and stimulates production and release of melanin by the melanocytes and causing skin darkening. So that's one reason why, like, there is an increase in release of melanocyte stimulating hormone in pregnant women. So you start getting darkening of skin, maybe blotches in places, or just general darkening of skin all over. It can happen. So just a little side comment there. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. All right, let's go on next slide. Oh, and this is reminding myself to talk about I already talked about it, where these parts came from. So the posterior lobe of the pituitary came from the diencephalon. So this is early diencephalon here, and the infundibulum is growing out and makes the stalk, and so you get this. And notice that this part here, it is coming down from the hypothalamus, so that's all neurotissue here. It's neural tissue coming down, making the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And this is the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. There. And so the anterior lobe was made from, this was the roof of the mouth, and so this little pouch, comes up and makes this portion here. And there's actually, it doesn't show it here, but there's actually a gap, this Rathke pouch here, there's actually a gap that ends up right in here. And you'll see it on some of the slides. So you have the pars intermedia, that's the intermediate part here. And the anterior lobe, intermediate lobe, and posterior lobe of the pituitary. You have your infundibulum here, one of my favorite words. I don't know why, I just like that word. And let's see. Then you call it the hypophyseal stalk because you get from the hypothalamus. So you have the coming down from the infundibulum. You don't have to, and I mentioned the tuber cinereum. You don't have to know all these things. Just know there's a anterior and posterior lobe of the pituitary. You don't have to know all these names. I'm going through these just to let you know there's a ton of stuff in anatomy that it just gets really deep. So, but here's the tuber cinereum region right here, that region there. So, okay, next slide. Here's a simplified version of the same table earlier, talking about hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary and hormones released from the posterior pituitary, and I already went over those. So we have GH, growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, AC, tropic hormone, ACTH, LH, FSH, ADH, and oxytocin. So, and you can see what else. And luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. We always think about those in terms of pregnancy, but they actually act on both ovary and testes. So just know that. So, and prolactin for milk production. Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates release of glucocorticoids from the adrenal gland, and thyroid gland you secrete thyroid hormones. And then growth hormone promotes growth by controlling protein, lipid, and carbohydrate metabolism. And let's see. So that's pretty much it. Okay, next slide. So here's another view of the pituitary gland. We're going to get into the pituitary for the next few slides and talk about it a lot. So here is the anterior. This is the anterior. And here's the posterior. Here's the sphenoid bone, the sella turcica. Okay, so that's the sella turcica all the way around here where the pituitary is sitting in there. Here's your infundibulum there. So coming down here, and you notice the hypothalamus, so all this neural tissue coming down into the posterior pituitary, also called the pars nervosa. And the anterior pituitary is also divided into various things. Pars intermedia sometimes in this diagram is put as part of the anterior pituitary, and that's usually where it's lumped in with. So, and then the optic chiasm. So you know that this is anterior and this is posterior on this side. So just to get you oriented as to where we are. Okay, next slide. Okay, we're going to do a little histology on the pituitary gland. Just look at slides for the next few slides going through here. So this is flipped around. So here's the posteriors on the left and the anteriors on the right here. So this shows you the anterior pituitary, what it looks like. Here's your infundibulum coming down here, and there's a little opening called the cleft here, and you'll see it on some of the other slides too. And so here's the pars nervosa, so the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. All right, just get your bearings. Okay, next slide. That's what it looks like in cross section. Next slide. Here we are in cross section again. So we have, this is this cleft here is that Rathke's pouch that I pointed out earlier. That's this whole thing here. And so here's the posterior pituitary, the nervosa, that's posterior, and posterior pituitary, and here's the anterior. And here's the pars intermedia, is this part through here, coming down all the way up like there. So that's the pars intermedia. And this is the anterior pituitary up here, and the hypothalamus region up here. So it's hanging down underneath the hypothalamus. So this is posterior, posterior, and anterior. And so your optic nerve will be coming off about somewhere up in this region up here. Okay, next slide. So here's the posterior pituitary. This picture's actually out of the Pearson site online. So posterior pituitary, showing there's a distinct difference in these tissues. So this is epithelial derived tissue here, and this is neural derived tissue over here in the posterior pituitary. So that's the and so we'll do enlargement on the next slide. And you start seeing a little bit more here. This is the neural tissue here, neural derived tissue, and the epithelial derived tissue on the right there, and higher magnification. And now we see the nervous tissue, and so we have, you can see it's mostly neuroglial cells in here. These are cells. These are actually called pituocytes. So it's not one of the typical neuroglial cells that we talked about in the central nervous system. These are specialized cells that release hormones. Then we have the anterior pituitary, which is glandular epithelial tissue. So that's why it's epithelial tissue, because it's actually producing a lot of the hormones, most of the hormones that are produced. And so there's all different types of cell types, and each one of those cell types will stain a different color because the things they're producing have different pHs, and so different stains react differently at different pHs to different things. So you have things called basophilic. It means they respond to more of a basic, and you have acidophilic cells that because they have a lot of a different type of compound that stains differently with an acid, with a stain that reacts more with acidic things. Usually the acidic stains are more like a pinkish color, and the basophilic are more of a bluish color. So, and I can't remember if I have any slides of that here. I don't think I do, but okay, next slide. It does point out some basophils. These are these darker ones, like there and here. And let's see, I don't know what that was there. Oh, the acidophils are these other ones here. You see they're pinker. So the basophils are darker, and the acidophils are a lighter reddish pink color. Then on the pituocytes over here, this is pointing out the nuclei. There's a nucleus of one. There's a nucleus of another one. So that's the posterior pituitary. Pituitary has the pituocytes in it. They're derived from neural tissue, and the anterior pituitary has all these basophils and acidophilic cells. Next slide. Well, and also you have this bit down the middle here. So there's your intermediate part down the middle. Okay, next slide. So here we are. It's a mid-sagittal section through the skull and down into the almost down to the shoulders about. So here's your hypothalamus. Let me go back to white again. Sorry. Here's your hypothalamus here. So that's the part that's coming down through here. Right. Here's your pituitary hanging off down, and here's your pituitary hanging off down here. Then on the back side, we have the pineal gland. Okay, pineal gland is a, and we have the thyroid gland down here as well. So, pineal gland secretes something called melatonin, and that's it tends to be secreted in darkness, which we're pretty sure it helps regulate sleep cycles, biological clock, that kind of stuff. So that's what the pineal gland is all about. So this is just showing you again where the hypothalamus and pituitary gland are in relation to the, and not to forget about the pineal gland back there on the back side, on the epithalamus up there in the there in the brain. So let's see. So next we're going to talk about, I think, thyroid. So next slide. Oh, good job. Yes, we are. So we are on to the thyroid. So the thyroid, so the hypothalamus tells the pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, and so the pituitary does, anterior pituitary does, and the thyroid stimulating hormone comes down to the thyroid, and so this is thyroid stimulating hormone. I use an abbreviation without spelling it out. So thyroid stimulating hormone is TSH. Okay, so that comes down and it acts on certain cells that are found in the thyroid gland. They're called follicle cells. Okay, and follicle cells are these cells right here. So it's these little cells there. There's one, and here's one, here's one. So the thyroid stimulating hormone acts on those cells and causes these cells to produce something called thyroglobulin. Okay, and thyroglobulin is converted into the thyroid hormones, thyroxine and triiodothyronine. My mouth is real dry, so I'm having a hard time talking. There's some other cells in the thyroid called parafollicular cells. They secrete calcitonin. Parafollicular meaning around the follicle, around the follicle cells. So we have these follicle cells, and then you have some parafollicular cells. These are just out around the side here. Okay, so here's a couple. Here's a few here, and there's a few down here, and a few over here. And then these are all the follicle cells. And they're all surrounding this big basin. Okay? So you got this, they make this, they're making this, this ball, basically. They cells all the way around it. And in the middle of it is this stuff, and this is called colloid. So these cells secrete, these follicle cells secrete thyroglobulin into the colloid, and so this is a gelatinous, thick, kind of sticky fluid that's inside each one of these little balls all the way around the thyroid. So here's the thyroid over here on the left. That's the thyroid. This whole thing here. I'm drawing fast, and then you have blood vessels supplying it. It's sitting right here, right on top of the windpipe up here. Okay, so there's your thyroid. And right in front of everything. And it's a real important gland. It's right there in front. It's not. It's kind of exposed right there on the front of your neck. So here's a follicle. So these are follicle cells. So this whole thing is a follicle. Okay, this whole thing, this whole bucket, the whole ball is a follicle, and they can contain this colloid, this protein viscous mixture that's in the middle of this, in the middle of each one of these follicles. And so we're going to talk about what happens and how thyroglobulin gets turned into triiodothyronine and thyroxine. And next slide.